Last class, we talked about the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. Today, we move into the 1980s and the presidency of Ronald Reagan. So, a little bit about Ronald Reagan first. He was born in 1911 and he died in 2004. Actually, remember when he died and the flags were at half mast. Didn't really know too much about him at the time, but I remember my dad was a big fan of his, so he was really sad when he died. His nicknames were Dutch, the Gipper, and the Great Communicator. You'll see why a little bit later. Grew up in a small town in Illinois, and as a teenager, he worked as a lifeguard. Some of y'all might work as lifeguards in the summer, and he actually saved a total of 77 lives during his 7 summers as a lifeguard. He was a guard sometimes at a river, other times at a pool. And after high school, he attended Eureka College in Illinois, a really small college, and he played football there and was also elected student body president. Now, while he was at Eureka College, he became very interested in theater, and he realized he was actually really good at acting. So he decided that he wanted to move to California, move to Hollywood, which at the time was a pretty new town because the movie industry was very new at the time, and he decided to become an actor. Now, his most famous role was in the movie King's Row. There was another one called Newt Rockne All-American, where he played what became known as the Gipper. The phrase "win one for the Gipper" is from there, but his favorite was the movie King's Row. And in 1940, he married another actor. He married actress Jane Wyman, but she actually divorced him a few years later after they had one kid together and then adopted another child. She divorced him. So Reagan and Trump are actually the only two presidents who have ever been divorced. One similarity they have. In 1952, he remarried. He married a woman named Nancy Davis, and he and Nancy remained married until he died in 2004. So we're married for about 52 years, and they were very much in love, he and Nancy Reagan. Now, Reagan became involved in politics in the 1950s, and he was a Democrat. Like a lot of actors these days get involved in politics, and Reagan was as well. And he was a Democrat, and his hero was FDR. But later on, as the 1950s wore on, and he saw the effects of communism on the world, and he didn't really care for the Democratic politicians or presidents of that time, he then became a conservative Republican and a vocal supporter of Barry Goldwater in 1964. Remember, he was the one who wrote that book, The Conscience of a Conservative, and he was the presidential candidate in 1964, but he lost to LBJ. And after Reagan supported Barry Goldwater, gave a really famous speech for him called A Time for Choosing, he was then elected governor of California in 1966, and he was a 2-term governor, served for 8 full years, at which point he decided to run for president, and he ran against Gerald Ford for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976. Remember, we talked about the primary process, and he was trying to become the Republican nominee for 1976, but he lost to Ford. He had 48% of the vote. Ford got 52% of the vote. So Ford became the Republican nominee in 1976, but Ford lost that election to Jimmy Carter, which we talked about last class. But Reagan wasn't done. He ran again in 1980, became the Republican candidate, and he ran against sitting president Jimmy Carter. Now, he had been a celebrity for a very long time at this point, Reagan had, and he was very likable, a very likable personality, very good reputation. Even those who disagreed with him really, really liked him. And sitting presidents usually have a huge advantage in their re-election campaigns. Right? For example, President Trump is probably still projected to win re-election, even though he's a fairly unpopular president, simply because he is the incumbent. He's the sitting president. So a lot of times, incumbents or sitting presidents have the advantage in their re-election campaigns. But Reagan destroyed President Carter in the 1980 election. He won 44 out of 50 states, huge landslide, and this marks a really big shift in American society that became known as the Reagan Revolution. Okay, other people see this as kind of the defining years of the rise of conservatism, which is what I called this unit. All right, so the person who ran for president, okay, who won the presidential election of 1980 was, of course, Ronald Reagan. There you see the electoral map right there. And one big reason why he won is because during the 1950s, a lot of Americans started to believe that the culture and society of America was going in a bad way. Okay, they thought that traditional morals and values had been lost with the generation gap and the clash of values. That society, as a result of the 1960s, had become too liberal, too far one way. That the entertainment industry had become too vulgar and explicit, and that family values were gone. And people wanted to kind of go back to the time of family values, of times like the 1950s. And this really became the majority thought in the late 1970s, and that's a big reason why Reagan was able to win in such a landslide. So the phrase is new right or new conservatism. Okay, right wing means conservative, left wing means liberal, and the new right was first formed by Barry Goldwater and kind of carried on by Ronald Reagan. And this group of supporters, group of thinkers, part of the new right, supported conservative social changes, things like the pro-life movement wanting to end abortion, which had been legalized with Roe versus Wade in 1973. They also advocated for lower taxes and increased defense spending. So all things that modern day conservatives and Republicans still advocate for. And there was something at this time that started called affirmative action. We briefly talked about it last class, and just a quick review here. This basically means favoring members of a historically disadvantaged group or minority in areas of employment, education, business, basically trying to give African Americans and Hispanics and other minorities more of a chance or a better chance to get into a good college or get a good job, and making it more difficult for white people and Asians. And basically tried to help minorities overcome past discrimination. And the phrase reverse discrimination started at this time, and that was the belief that affirmative action was actually an overcorrection, that instead of just making things equal, it had gone too far the other way and was discriminating against white people, against men, against Asians. And for that reason, a lot of people said that affirmative action was actually against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 instead of just a continuation of that. So big disagreement in America about affirmative action. There was also another group at this time that kind of overlapped with the new right called the moral majority. And the moral majority was basically religious groups, mostly Christian, people who favored conservative morals and values. So once again, things like pro-life, and also supported prayer in public schools. You had a lot of pastors, televangelists, they were called, preachers on TV, missionaries who would gain a lot of following. The biggest of which, of course, is Billy Graham, the guy in the picture right there. He was incredibly influential. He preached the word of the Bible to more people than anyone in all of history, millions upon millions of people. And he traveled to so many different countries. He had such a huge following on television and on the radio, and was just a super influential person. He is also called the president to pastors because every president from Harry S. Truman all the way through Obama met with Billy Graham to get his views on the Bible, on Christianity, how to maneuver morally difficult situations. So really impactful guy, and he died in 2018. Now, there were a lot of problems and issues that existed in the 1980s that conservative groups really wanted to solve. Things like drug use was on the rise, especially with cocaine. Crime was on the rise once again, and just an overall lack of morals and values in society. So a major policy of Reagan's administration was to combat all of these things, as well as lowering federal income tax rates. He said lower taxes is the way to a better economy, because remember, the economy was really bad in the late 70s and early 80s. Another big reason why Carter lost to Reagan in 1980. Okay, so personality traits of Ronald Reagan, obviously conservative, also very good speaker, one of the most excellent public speakers we've ever had. That's why he gained the nickname the Great Communicator. Also had kind of this grandfather personality, very likable, and had a very great sense of humor. You can just search on YouTube Ronald Reagan humor, and just several times in his speeches, he'll just have very witty things that he would say, and he would just make people really like him. Also had kind of a cowboy persona, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, very American man, and that really attracted a lot of people. And as you know, before he was a politician, he was an actor. A lot of people said that really helped him out quite a bit. So although Reagan was mostly popular, especially right when he got elected, there was one assassination attempt on his life. And that was on March 30th, 1981. Now, this is just 2 months after Reagan took office, and he was shot in the chest by a man named John Hinckley, and the bullet punctured one of Reagan's lungs, and it lodged less than an inch from his heart. There you see the action shots right there, like right before he got shot, and then right afterwards, you see his special what's it called, Secret Service, shoving him into his limousine. So he was rushed to George Washington University Hospital, where the doctors were able to save his life, and thankfully he was spared. So while he was being brought back to the surgery, it was just a sense of his humor there. He famously said to the doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans, because otherwise they might let him die." He was kind of joking there. And then when his wife Nancy came in, she said, "What happened?" And he said, "Sorry, honey, I forgot to duck." But yeah, this is the most recent assassination attempt on a president's life, thankfully. So hopefully we will never have one again. But one thing to keep in mind is that if the bullet would have traveled just one more inch, Reagan would have died. Okay, it would have hit his heart, and he would have died just 2 months into his presidency, and he would not have been the great and influential president that he was for 8 years. So this is called the miracle of a fraction of an inch. Reagan won the election of 1984 as well, his re-election, and there were a lot of reasons for that. And the big one was because the economy had really improved tremendously over his first 4 years as president. Also, American patriotism and confidence had surged. People were beginning to feel good about being Americans again, and feel optimistic about where our country was heading. And also, the Cold War was really beginning to thaw. And Reagan ran against this guy, Walter Mondale. He was Jimmy Carter's former vice president, and Reagan won 49 out of 50 states. Now, there's this one other election that we learned about when someone won 49 out of 50 states, and that was Richard Nixon. And this is the only other time in history where that big of a landslide had been accomplished. So the U.S. economy was in decline during most of the late 1970s, because after the Vietnam War, you had unemployment very high, stagflation, as we talked about, high gas prices, etc. Just very bad time in America. And when Reagan came in, his solution, the plan that he said that was going to fix all this, was called supply-side economics. And this was the belief that increased supply to the market would grow the economy. And the best way to increase supply, Reagan said, is to invest in businesses, and therefore we need to give tax cuts to the rich. So instead of taxing rich people more money to get more money into the government, he said if we make rich people pay less money, then they'll have more money to create jobs. However, defense spending, according to supply-side economics, should still be high to keep us safe. And this became known as Reaganomics. All right, so those terms, supply-side economics and Reaganomics, they're interchangeable. Make sure you know those terms. All right, so at a bleak time of pessimism in 1980, when he first ran for election, Reagan really sparked this surge of patriotism in the American people. He optimistically communicated his beliefs that Jimmy Carter is wrong, that our best days are not behind us. We don't just have to get used to not having enough gasoline or enough food or not being number one on the world stage. He said, no, America's best days are ahead of us, not behind us. And he really kind of made it cool to be patriotic. It used to be, if you said you loved your country or were patriotic, people are like, why do you love this country? I mean, this is a terrible place to live. And Reagan kind of sold patriotism with a smile and kind of made people feel good about being patriotic and loving their country again. You saw a lot more people flying flags outside of their home again and talking about how much they love America. And he really inspired people to start believing in their country again and to really be proud to be Americans. So 1980, with President Carter's approval ratings very low, Reagan defeated Carter in a landslide, as we saw previously. Okay, so a little bit more about the supply-side economics, or Reaganomics, that we just talked about. This was the plan that Reagan immediately began pursuing once he took office, and this focused on reducing business and personal income taxes. That was the main cornerstone of Reaganomics, or supply-side economics, was lower taxes. So a lot of people said we need to raise taxes to have more money coming into the government so that they can help us fix the problem. But Reagan said we shouldn't look to the government to fix the problem, because government is the problem. He said government spends too much and takes away our money. Instead, he said taxes need to be low so people can invest into the economy themselves and create jobs for themselves. So it also took away government regulations And this, Reagan said, would spark economic growth and end what he called stagflation. This is something that Ronald Reagan has in common with President Trump. President Trump also believes in this kind of Reaganomics, supply-side economics theory that lowering taxes and cutting regulations on businesses and the economy is good for the economy. So the results of Reaganomics. Now, at first, the economy remained stagnant and it did not grow. And people are saying, well, what in the world? But we thought this Reaganomics thing was going to work. And so far, the unemployment rate hasn't gone down, the price of gas hasn't gone down, and we're still in stagflation. We're still having inflation and stagnation in the economy. So for about 2 years, the economy did not get better. But then, at the end of 2 years of this policy, Reagan just kept saying, be patient, eventually it'll work, and the economy will self-correct, because we needed this time to kind of correct the market, and eventually it will grow. And sure enough, at the end of 2 years of the policy, the economy started booming again for the first time in 20 years. This was really for the first time since the early 1960s that the economy was really good. And it's debated whether or not Reagan's policies were what sparked this positive change. Okay, so the fact is, Reagan became president. He implemented Reaganomics. 2 years later, the economy surged, and it was very, very good throughout the rest of the 1980s. Okay, so if you ask a Republican, they'll say that the economy got really good because of Reaganomics. And if you ask a Democrat, they'll say the economy got really good in spite of Reaganomics. Okay, so there's still debate today about whether or not Reaganomics actually works, and I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself. Okay, but the economy was very good throughout the rest of the 1980s. So Reagan's actions as president are the main reasons why this era of the late 70s, 80s, early 90s is called the rise of conservatism to most historians. But this movement was not just confined to the United States. I know we're focusing a lot on America now, but this is world history, and it's important to know who else played a part here as well. And one woman who did almost as much as Reagan in this era was Margaret Thatcher. I have a picture of her on my wall. And she was the Prime Minister of the UK from 1979 to 1990. Okay, she was the first female Prime Minister of Great Britain. Okay, so definitely a landmark, kind of groundbreaking accomplishment there for women. And Thatcher was very, very similar to Reagan. Her views were almost identical to Reagan on the economy, on the military, on social policies. They were very much kindred spirits. They became very close friends as well. Okay, they met several times and worked together on a lot of foreign policy and were pretty much best friends throughout their times in office. And she's also the longest serving prime minister of the 20th century. She's in office for over a decade. Now, Thatcher is known as England's Reagan, and Reagan is known as America's Thatcher. Okay, so really the two of them together were able to accomplish quite a bit. And another ally during the 1980s, in addition to Reagan and Thatcher, was Pope John Paul II. Okay, he was the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. I know we talked a lot about popes earlier on this year when we talked about like the Middle Ages and the Reformation, but there still is a pope. Okay, the current pope is Pope Francis, and Pope John Paul II was pope from 1978 until 2005. Okay, so during the 1980s, he was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, as you know, very powerful position. So he was actually from Poland. He was from Eastern Europe, and if you remember, Eastern Europe at this time was under the occupation of the Soviet communists. So he had lived through both the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Soviet occupation of Poland. So when he became pope, when he got this platform and this power, he became a huge advocate for Eastern Europe, which was still under Soviet communist control at this time. He preached against communism and for freedom. So Pope John Paul II, along with Reagan, along with Thatcher, eventually helped free Eastern Europe, collapse the Soviet Union, and end the Cold War. Now, Reagan was nicknamed the Great Communicator because he was able to state complex issues in a very simple way. Okay, you guys know that the kind of teachers who can talk about really complicated intellectual stuff, but say it in a way that you understand. That's what Reagan was like, right? He would just sit down and talk to the American people on a broadcast and say, tonight I want to talk to you about taxes. And he'd talk about these incredibly complex economic things, but in just such a simple way to where people understood. One of his big programs that he pushed, and he communicated this as well, was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. It was also known as the Star Wars defense system because Star Wars were movies coming out at this time, is what some people called it. It was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. And this was Reagan's plan to develop technological systems that would be able to intercept Soviet missiles before they reach our country. All right, this cost a ton of money, and it was actually never fully developed, but it scared the heck out of the USSR because they said, wait a second, if they can actually develop a satellite or laser system that they can launch into space that will vaporize our nuclear missiles if launched, then it will be like we don't have any nuclear missiles at all. Okay, so it really scared them because they saw it as something that put a threat on them. Okay, so us investing in this caused the Soviet Union to also invest in something like this of their own, and eventually served to bankrupt the Soviet Union, which eventually led to its collapse and the end of the Cold War. So the primary reason for the increase in debt between 1980 and the 1990s is high levels of spending by the federal government. As you know, our national debt is out of control. Right now, while I'm recording this, the debt is around 22 trillion. When you watch it, it'll probably be even more than that. The debt is just out of control. And if you see on this chart here, the debt was not always a problem. Okay, here you see it throughout the 1900s. It's really not until the 1980s that we got over $1 trillion. Okay, and since then, from 1980 to 1996, it increased more and more and more to about 5 trillion. And then it's plateaued for a little bit. It was balanced for 2 years under Bill Clinton. And then after that, here you have Bush, here you have Obama, all right? And it's projected that it will rise even more in the coming years. And the big reason for this is high levels of spending by the federal government. Both Democrats and Republicans have a spending problem. Republicans tend to spend way more money on the military, and Democrats tend to spend way more money on social programs like welfare and Medicaid and Medicare. Now, the area where Reagan spent the most money was defense, and that has been a major goal of the Republican Party since the 1980s. It's been to increase defense spending. Now, one tragedy that happened during Reagan's time in office was the Challenger explosion. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded just a few seconds after it took off, all right? And it killed everybody on board, all 8 people, including the woman who would have been the first teacher in space, all right? So imagine watching this live. Millions of people were watching this live, and they saw it explode. It was just heart-wrenching, okay? It was kind of similar, you could say, to like the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, okay? Probably not quite to that scale, but that's kind of how it felt in America at the time, that these astronauts were killed. Okay? We had never lost someone in flight before, and this was the first time that had happened. And this was really a national tragedy, and Reagan was able to really comfort the American people very well afterward. We're actually going to watch the video of him speaking to America after the Challenger explosion. Another problem that surfaced in the 1980s was the discovery of this new disease that had become known as AIDS. And AIDS primarily affected homosexual men, and it was also often spread through sexual contact between men. That's still the case. AIDS still does exist. It's not as much of a threat now because we understand it better, know how to prevent it better, and can treat it much better. So AIDS, over 90% of the cases were and are spread by homosexual contact. But AIDS also spread to a small number of heterosexuals, mostly through the use of intravenous needles, like sharing intravenous needles while doing drugs. So there were a lot of myths and scare tactics that were kind of used to make everyone feel at risk. But at the same time, it was still a big problem for those who did have AIDS. And there was a big controversy in the country about how we should go about combating this disease, okay? Because whether or not it's a threat to you, if you're not a homosexual male, it's still something that people are suffering from and dying from, and should try to be solved. So there was controversy about what to do about this. Some said that we should encourage morality to combat the disease, basically saying, if you don't want this disease, don't have homosexual contact, okay? Don't use drugs with intravenous needles, okay, things like that. And then others said, no, we shouldn't encourage that because it's a lifestyle. Instead, we should use more government money and fund AIDS research to find a cure for AIDS. And then some people said, well, why can't we do both? So AIDS was one of the few things that divided the country during the 1980s. Remember, we talked about how during Vietnam we were very divided. In the 1980s, it was very different. All right, the 1980s was a time of a lot of unity in America, but this is one of the few things that actually did divide Americans. Now, there was a scandal that President Reagan was involved in 1986 and 1987. This was called the Iran-Contra affair. So what happened here was that several members of Reagan's staff sold weapons to Iran and then used that money to fund a group called the Contras, which was a right-wing militant group that was fighting the socialist rule called the Sandinista in Nicaragua. Okay, so Reagan's staff members had also hoped to secure the release of 7 U.S. hostages with this deal. Okay, so this was a big deal, okay, this scandal, because by selling weapons to Iran, we are selling weapons to a hostile supporter of terrorism. And also by funding the Contras, this had specifically been prohibited by Congress. Okay, so some say this was a bad law. It shouldn't have been prohibited by Congress, but still it was, and so this was breaking the law there. And then also an arms for hostages deal, that directly violates our policy of we do not negotiate with terrorists. Okay, so this entire scandal was seen as something that threatened our national security. Now remember the Watergate scandal. Okay, remember how relatively small of a deal it was at first and how big of a deal it was because of the way that Nixon handled it poorly. All right, so when this action was revealed to Reagan that certain members of his staff had actually done this, he went on air, told the American people there had been no exchange of arms for hostages. But after an investigation, it was actually revealed that in fact there had been, but Reagan just didn't know about it. So immediately he went back, apologized to the public on behalf of his administration, and 11 of his staff members were either fired or convicted. One of the guys was named Ollie North, and he was the one who diverted money from Iran to fund the Contras without Reagan's knowledge. And he was sentenced to 3 years in jail, 2 years probation, and 1,200 hours of community service for violating this law. Okay, so he was really the one who went down here. There may have been other people more involved, but he kind of took the heat. So throughout the Iran-Contra affair, people thought this might be the next Watergate. This might have to end in Reagan's impeachment or resignation. But Reagan had learned from Nixon's mistakes. He was a student of history. And instead of lying about it and trying to cover it up when he learned about it, like Nixon did, he faced the scandal head on and was honest and apologetic to the American people and very quickly admitted his mistakes. So this is why Reagan is not defined by this scandal like Nixon was defined by Watergate. All right, but a major result of the Watergate and Iran-Contra scandals is that both of these led to lower public confidence in government officials. We just weren't sure if we could trust our presidents anymore. Two more things about Reagan here. He also appointed the first female Supreme Court justice in U.S. history. Her name was Sandra Day O'Connor. She was conservative in some ways, but she was also liberal in other ways. She supported something called the Equal Rights Amendment, so really kind of a moderate, sometimes voted with the liberals, sometimes with the conservatives. Throughout his presidency, Reagan had a great sense of humor. Like I said before, you should look up on YouTube Ronald Reagan humor or Soviet jokes. Okay, he was a really funny guy, and he was really loved by most people, even those who disagreed with his politics. So he left office after 8 years with historically high approval ratings. They had improved over the course of his presidency, even though they had started out a little bit lower because the economy didn't fix immediately. But by this point, most people loved him, and most people wanted 4 more years of Ronald Reagan. But of course, you can't serve more than 8 years, so he left office, and the next person to be president was his vice president, George H.W. Bush.